In the vast wilderness of 1880s Arizona territory, where the scorching sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, love stories were rare treasures. Most tales that emerged from this harsh land spoke of survival, conflict, and loss. But sometimes, in the most unexpected corners of the frontier, a story would unfold that would remind people that the human heart could triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. This is one such story, a tale of courage, cunning, and the lengths one man would go to protect the woman he loved from a fate worse than death. It's a story that proves that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with guns and horses, but with wit, determination, and an unshakable belief in what's right. In a time when women had few choices and Native American communities faced constant pressure from expanding settlements, when traditions clashed with personal freedom, and when a single decision could mean the difference between happiness and a lifetime of misery, one rancher would devise a plan so audacious, so carefully orchestrated, that it would become legend among the people of the Southwest. What you're about to discover is not just a love story, but a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through intelligence, bravery, and the unwavering support of unexpected allies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Broken Arrow Ranch as Thomas Mackenzie stood on his porch, watching the horizon with troubled eyes. For 3 weeks now, he had been wrestling with a problem that seemed to have no solution. The woman he loved, Morningstar, was being forced into a marriage that would destroy her spirit and, quite possibly, her life. Thomas had first met Morningstar 2 years earlier when she had come to his ranch seeking work as a translator. Her father, chief running bear of the Chiricahua Apache, had been trying to establish peaceful trade relationships with the local ranchers, and Morningstar's fluency in both Apache and English made her invaluable in these negotiations. What had started as a professional relationship had slowly blossomed into something deeper, though both knew the dangers of their feelings in a world that rarely accepted such unions. Morningstar was unlike any woman Thomas had ever known. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, she commanded respect wherever she went. Her intelligence was sharp as a blade, her spirit unbreakable, and her heart generous beyond measure. She moved with the grace of someone who understood both the traditional ways of her people and the changing world around them. In Apache, her name meant the light that guides through darkness, and Thomas had come to understand how perfectly it suited her. The problem that now consumed Thomas's every waking moment had begun 3 weeks ago when Morningstar had arrived at his ranch in tears. Her younger sister, Evening Rose, had fallen gravely ill with what the medicine man believed might be a curse sent by angry spirits. The only way to appease these spirits, according to the tribal council's interpretation of their traditions, was for Morningstar to marry Chief Wolf Shadow of a neighboring Apache band. Wolf Shadow was a man of 45 years, known for his cruelty to his previous 3 wives, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. The marriage was not just about appeasing spirits. It was also a political alliance that would strengthen both tribes against the increasing pressure from U.S. military forces in the region. Wolf Shadow had specifically requested Morningstar as his bride, having heard tales of her beauty and intelligence. The tribal council, desperate to secure this alliance, and believing it might save Evening Rose, had agreed to the arrangement despite Morningstar's protests. Thomas knew that in Apache tradition, refusing such a marriage would bring shame upon her entire family, and could result in her being cast out from the tribe completely. But accepting it meant condemning her to a life of misery, and quite likely an early death at the hands of a man who viewed women as property to be controlled and discarded. As Thomas stood on his porch that morning, he was joined by his ranch foreman, Carlos Medina, a man of Mexican and Apache heritage who had worked for the Mackenzie family for over 15 years. Carlos had become like a brother to Thomas, and his connections to both the Mexican and Apache communities had made him an invaluable ally in navigating the complex relationships of the border region. "You've been wearing a hole in those floorboards for 3 weeks now," Carlos observed, settling into a chair beside Thomas. "Have you come up with anything that might work?" Thomas shook his head, his frustration evident. "Every plan I come up with seems to create more problems than it solves. If we simply help her run away, she'll never be able to return to her family, and they'll suffer for her absence. If we try to negotiate with Wolf Shadow, he's already made it clear he won't accept any other arrangement. And if we involve the territorial authorities, it might start a conflict that could hurt both tribes. Carlos was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. What if we approach this differently? What if instead of fighting against the marriage or running from it, we find a way to make it impossible for it to happen according to Apache law itself? Thomas turned to look at his friend with interest. What do you mean? In Apache tradition, there are certain circumstances under which a promised marriage must be called off. If the bride is already married, for instance, or if she's proven to be unsuitable according to tribal law, or Carlos paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face, or if completing the marriage would violate sacred law. But how can we make any of those things apply to Morningstar's situation? Carlos stood up and began pacing, his mind clearly working through possibilities. I've been thinking about the stories my Apache grandmother used to tell me. They're old laws, very old laws, that most people have forgotten about. Laws about sacred visions, about spiritual callings that supersede earthly arrangements. Thomas felt a spark of hope. Tell me more. According to the oldest traditions, if someone receives a vision quest that calls them to serve the spirits in a specific way, no earthly authority can force them into a path that would interfere with that calling. The problem is that such visions are rare, and they must be verified by the tribal spiritual leaders. So we need Morningstar to have a vision quest, and we need the medicine men to confirm it as genuine? Exactly. But it's not as impossible as it sounds. My grandmother always said that the spirits often speak to those who are pure of heart and facing great trials. And there are ways to encourage such visions to occur. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You're talking about the sacred plants? Carlos nodded slowly. Peyote ceremonies are still practiced, though not as openly as they once were. If Morningstar were to participate in such a ceremony, and if she were to receive a genuine vision during it, which often happens to those who are spiritually ready, then the tribal council would have no choice but to honor that vision. But how do we ensure she receives the right kind of vision? And how do we make sure the medicine men will support her? That's where it gets complicated, Carlos admitted. The vision would have to be genuine. You can't fake something like that, and the medicine men would know immediately if someone were lying about their spiritual experience. But if Morningstar is truly meant to follow a different path, if her heart is calling her towards something else, then the spirits might very well speak to her during the ceremony. Thomas considered this possibility. He knew that Morningstar had always felt torn between her loyalty to Apache traditions and her desire to help bridge the gap between her people and the changing world around them. She had often spoken of feeling called to be a peacemaker, a translator not just of languages but of understanding between different peoples. There's another element we need to consider, Carlos continued. Even if Morningstar receives a vision that calls her to a different path, we need to have a concrete plan for what that path looks like. The tribal council won't accept a vague calling. They need to see that she has a specific purpose that serves the greater good of the Apache people. What kind of purpose? Think about what's happening in this territory right now. The Apache people are facing enormous challenges. The U.S. government is putting more and more pressure on them to move to reservations. Their traditional way of life is being threatened from every direction. They need people who can help them navigate this changing world while still honoring their traditions. Thomas began to see where Carlos was heading. You're thinking that Morningstar's calling could be to serve as a cultural bridge, to help her people adapt to the new realities while preserving what's most important from the old ways. Exactly. And that's not something she could do if she were married to Wolf Shadow and living in his camp, isolated from the broader world. Her calling would require her to remain free to move between different communities, to learn new skills, to work with various leaders. The more Thomas thought about it, the more sense it made. Morningstar had natural gifts that were perfectly suited to such a role. Her intelligence, her language skills, her deep understanding of both Apache culture and the outside world. All of these could be invaluable to her people during this difficult period of transition. But we're still talking about taking an enormous risk, Thomas pointed out. If the plan doesn't work, if the tribal council doesn't accept her vision, then we'll have made her situation even worse. Carlos nodded gravely. That's true, but consider the alternative. If she goes through with this marriage to Wolf Shadow, she'll likely be dead within a year or two. At least this way, we're giving her a chance to fight for her freedom in a way that honors her people's traditions. As they continued discussing the details, Thomas found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they were contemplating. If successful, their plan wouldn't just save Morningstar from an unwanted marriage. It might also provide her people with exactly the kind of leader they needed during this critical time in their history. The morning grew hot as they talked, but neither man noticed the rising temperature. They were too absorbed in working out the details of what was becoming an increasingly complex but potentially brilliant strategy. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they had the basic framework of a plan that just might work. The key would be timing. The marriage ceremony was scheduled to take place in just over 2 weeks during the next new moon. That gave them very little time to set everything in motion. They would need to arrange for Morningstar to participate in a peyote ceremony, ensure that the right spiritual leaders were present to witness and validate any vision she might receive, and have a concrete proposal ready for how her newfound spiritual calling would benefit the Apache people. But perhaps most importantly, they would need Morningstar herself to be willing to take this enormous risk. The plan would only work if she genuinely opened herself to the possibility of receiving a spiritual vision, and if she was prepared to dedicate her life to serving her people in a new way. When do we talk to her about this? Thomas asked as they finally took shelter from the midday heat. Tonight, Carlos replied. She's supposed to come here after sunset to help with the translation of those new territorial documents. We'll explain everything to her then, and let her decide if she's willing to try it. That evening, as the desert air began to cool and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Morningstar arrived at the ranch. Thomas and Carlos had spent the afternoon refining their plan, thinking through every possible complication and preparing for her questions and concerns. When they explained their idea to her, Morningstar listened in complete silence, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight as she absorbed every detail. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the star-filled sky. You're asking me to risk everything on the possibility that the spirits will speak to me in a vision, she said finally. We're asking you to be open to the possibility that there might be a path forward that honors both your people's traditions and your own calling, Thomas replied gently. Morningstar turned back to them, and they could see the conflict in her eyes. And if the spirits don't speak to me? If I participate in the ceremony and receive no vision, or if the vision I receive doesn't provide a way out of this marriage, then we'll find another way, Thomas promised. But Morningstar, Carlos, and I both believe that you were meant for something greater than becoming Wolf Shadow's fourth wife. Your people need leaders who can help them navigate the challenges ahead, and you have gifts that could make an enormous difference in their survival. There's something else to consider, Carlos added quietly. Your sister, Evening Rose. Her illness, some of the older women in the tribe have been whispering that it's not spirits causing her sickness. They think it might be poison, administered slowly over time. Morningstar's eyes widened with shock, and then narrowed with anger. Wolf Shadow. It's possible. He's known to have used such methods before to pressure families into arrangements that benefit him. If that's true, then this marriage wouldn't save Evening Rose. It would just give him what he wants while your sister continues to suffer. This revelation seemed to settle something in Morningstar's mind. When she spoke again, her voice was firm with resolve. Tell me exactly what I would need to do. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of careful preparation and secret meetings. Carlos had reached out to his contacts in the Apache community, particularly to an elderly medicine man named Singing Crow, who had known Carlos's Apache grandmother and trusted his judgment. Singing Crow was one of the few remaining spiritual leaders who still knew the ancient ceremonies and had the authority to validate spiritual visions. Thomas spent those days learning everything he could about Apache spiritual traditions and the legal frameworks that might support Morningstar's potential calling. He rode to the territorial capital to research precedents for similar situations, using his connections with government officials to understand how such a spiritual calling might be recognized and protected under both Apache law and territorial jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Morningstar prepared herself mentally and spiritually for what lay ahead. She fasted for 2 days, purifying her body according to traditional practices. She also spent long hours in meditation and prayer, opening her mind to whatever guidance the spirits might offer. During this time, she found herself reflecting deeply on her life's purpose and the role she might play in her people's future. On the third evening, Singing Crow arrived at the ranch after nightfall, accompanied by two other respected elders from the tribe. The old medicine man was a figure of considerable authority, known for his wisdom and his unwavering commitment to Apache traditions. His presence alone lent credibility to what they were attempting. Carlos tells me that this young woman seeks guidance from the spirits about her path forward. Singing Crow said as he settled beside the fire they had prepared in a secluded canyon on Thomas's property. He also tells me that she faces a marriage that may not be in harmony with her true calling. Morningstar nodded respectfully. I have always felt that the spirits were calling me to serve my people in some way, but I have never been certain what that service should look like. Now, with this forced marriage approaching, I feel the need to understand what the spirits truly want from me. Singing Crow studied her face in the flickering firelight. The sacred medicine can open doorways to understanding, but it can also show us truths that are difficult to bear. Are you prepared for whatever wisdom the spirits might share with you? I am, Morningstar replied without hesitation. The ceremony began at midnight, under a canopy of stars that seemed especially bright that night. Following ancient protocols, the participants had cleansed themselves in a nearby stream and offered prayers to the four directions. The sacred peyote had been prepared according to traditional methods, with Singing Crow leading the prayers and blessing the medicine. As Morningstar consumed the sacred plant, she felt a deep sense of calm settle over her. The medicine worked slowly, gradually opening her consciousness to experiences beyond the ordinary world. The other participants maintained their prayers and songs throughout the night, creating a protective spiritual environment for her journey. What happened next would later be recounted in Apache oral tradition as one of the most profound visions of the modern era. As the medicine took full effect, Morningstar found herself transported to a place that existed both in the physical world and beyond it, a vast mesa that overlooked all the lands where Apache people had ever lived. In her vision, she saw a great eagle soaring above the mesa, its wings spanning wider than any earthly bird. The eagle spoke to her in a voice that resonated not just in her ears, but throughout her entire being. Daughter of the Apache, you stand at a crossroads, not just of your own life, but of your people's survival, the eagle said. The old ways are not disappearing. They're transforming. Your role is to be a bridge between what was and what must be to help your people adapt without losing their souls. The eagle showed her visions of the challenges facing Apache communities, forced relocations, the loss of traditional territories, the pressure to abandon cultural practices. But it also showed her possibilities for adaptation and survival, ways that Apache people could maintain their essential identity while learning to navigate the new realities of their changing world. You will not serve by becoming one man's wife, and, living in isolation, the eagle continued. You will serve by remaining free to move between worlds, to learn the tools your people need for survival, to teach others how to preserve what is sacred while embracing what is necessary for life. The vision evolved to show Morningstar specific tasks she would need to undertake. She saw herself establishing schools where Apache children could learn both traditional knowledge and the skills they would need in the modern world. She saw herself working with tribal leaders to negotiate fair treaties and agreements. She saw herself documenting Apache history and traditions to ensure they would not be lost to future generations. Most powerfully, she saw herself working to change how outsiders viewed Apache people, helping to dispel the myths and stereotypes that justify their mistreatment. In the vision, she stood before groups of government officials, military leaders, and settlers, speaking with such eloquence and wisdom that they could no longer see Apache people as savages to be conquered, but as human beings deserving of respect and fair treatment. This calling will require you to sacrifice the traditional path of marriage and motherhood, the eagle warned. But in serving all Apache children, you will be mother to generations. In remaining unmarried to any one man, you will be free to serve the Great Spirit's purpose for your life. As dawn approached and the effects of the sacred medicine began to fade, Morningstar found herself back in the canyon, surrounded by the medicine man and elders who had maintained their vigil throughout the night. She could see from their faces that they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just her vision, but spiritual phenomena that had manifested around the fire during her journey. Singing Crow leaned forward, his ancient eyes bright with wonder. Child, tell us what you have seen. Morningstar recounted her vision in detail, speaking for nearly an hour as she described everything the eagle had shown her. As she spoke, the elders exchanged meaningful glances, and she could see recognition in their faces. When she finished, Singing Crow was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with reverence. What you have described is not a simple vision. It is a calling of the highest order. The eagle you encountered is the messenger of the Great Spirit himself. The path you have been shown is sacred work that will require your entire life's dedication. One of the other elders, an elderly woman named Gray Wolf Woman, nodded in agreement. I have heard stories of such callings from my grandmother, but I have never witnessed one myself. This young woman has been chosen for sacred work that supersedes all earthly obligations. What does this mean for the marriage arrangement? Morningstar asked, though she sensed she already knew the answer. It means that no earthly authority can force you into a marriage that would prevent you from fulfilling your sacred calling. Singing Crow replied firmly. Apache law has always recognized that spiritual obligations take precedence over social arrangements. What you have received is not just a vision. It is a divine commission. Gray Wolf Woman reached into her medicine bundle and withdrew a small eagle feather, which she handed to Morningstar. This will serve as proof of your calling. When the tribal council sees this feather and hears the testimony of what we have witnessed here tonight, they will understand that your path has been set by powers far greater than any earthly arrangement. As the sun rose over the canyon, Thomas and Carlos emerged from where they had been waiting at a respectful distance. The transformation in Morningstar was visible to all of them. She carried herself with a new sense of purpose and authority that seemed to radiate from within. The spirits have spoken, Singing Crow announced to them. This woman has received a sacred calling that will serve all Apache people. She must not be bound by any arrangement that would interfere with this work. But even as they celebrated this spiritual breakthrough, they all understood that the real test was yet to come. Wolf Shadow and his supporters would not give up easily, especially when they learned that their political alliance was being threatened. The tribal council would need to be convinced not just of the authenticity of Morningstar's vision, but of its practical implications for their people's welfare. We need to move quickly, Carlos advised as they prepared to leave the canyon. Wolf Shadow is expecting to conclude the marriage negotiations within the next few days. If we're going to present this to the tribal council, it needs to happen before he arrives for the ceremony. Singing Crow nodded. I will call for an emergency council meeting this afternoon. It is unusual, but the circumstances are extraordinary. Gray Wolf Woman, and I will present the spiritual evidence, but Morningstar will need to explain the practical aspects of her calling, how exactly she intends to serve the people in this new role. This was the moment Thomas had been both anticipating and dreading. The success of their plan now depended not just on the authenticity of Morningstar's spiritual experience, but on their ability to present a compelling case for how her freedom to pursue this calling would benefit the entire Apache community. I've been working on that, Thomas said, pulling out a carefully prepared document from his saddlebags. I've researched similar situations in other territories, and I've drafted a proposal for how Morningstar's work could be structured to provide maximum benefit to Apache communities. The proposal Thomas had developed was comprehensive and practical. It outlined a role for Morningstar as a cultural liaison and advocate, someone who would work to establish educational programs, negotiate fair business relationships between Apache and non-Apache communities, and serve as a voice for Apache interests in territorial and federal government proceedings. Crucially, the proposal also addressed the political concerns that had motivated the original marriage arrangement. Instead of a military alliance secured through marriage, the Apache people would gain something potentially more valuable, a skilled advocate who could help them navigate the complex legal and political challenges they faced in dealing with U.S. authorities. The key is showing them that this calling isn't just about Morningstar's personal freedom, Thomas explained as they reviewed the proposal. It's about providing the Apache people with tools and resources they need for long-term survival and prosperity. Carlos added, we also need to address the immediate concern about Evening Rose's illness. If our suspicions about Wolf Shadow are correct, then preventing this marriage might actually be necessary to save her life. Morningstar had been quiet during this discussion, still processing the profound experience of the night before. But Now she spoke with the clear voice of someone who had found her true purpose. "I understand now why the spirits showed me what they did," she said. "Our people are at a crossroads, and they need leaders who can help them adapt without losing what makes us Apache. This isn't just about avoiding an unwanted marriage. It's about stepping into the role I was meant to play in our people's future." As they rode back toward the Apache settlement, each of them carried a sense of both hope and apprehension. They had accomplished the first part of their plan successfully, but the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The tribal council meeting that afternoon would determine not just Morningstar's fate, but potentially the future direction of her entire community. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky as they approached the settlement, and Morningstar felt the eagle feather in her hand as a reminder of the vision that had changed everything. She was no longer the same woman who had come to Thomas's ranch 3 weeks ago, desperate and afraid. She was now someone who had been chosen for a sacred purpose, and she was ready to fight for the right to fulfill that calling. The time for planning and preparation was over. Now came the moment of truth. The Apache settlement buzzed with unusual activity as word spread that an emergency tribal council meeting had been called. Such gatherings were rare and typically indicated either urgent danger or matters of extraordinary importance. By early afternoon, representatives from all the major family groups had gathered in the large ceremonial lodge at the center of the settlement. Morningstar sat with Singing Crow and Gray Wolf Woman near the sacred fire that burned at the center of the lodge. The eagle feather rested in her lap, catching the light from the flames. Around the circle sat the 12 council members who would decide her fate, including her own father, Chief Running Bear, whose face showed the strain of the impossible position he found himself in. Wolf Shadow had not yet arrived for the scheduled marriage ceremony, but his representatives were present, 2 stern-faced warriors who had come to ensure that the agreed-upon arrangements were honored. Their presence added tension to an already charged atmosphere. Chief Running Bear opened the proceedings with the traditional invocations, calling upon the spirits of the ancestors to guide their deliberations. When the formal opening was complete, he turned to Singing Crow with obvious reluctance. "Medicine Man, you have called this emergency gathering. What matter requires such urgent attention from the council?" Singing Crow rose slowly, his aged joints protesting the movement. Despite his physical frailty, his voice carried the authority of decades of spiritual leadership. "Honored council members, I bring before you a matter that touches the very heart of our sacred traditions. 3 nights ago, in the ancient manner, I conducted a vision ceremony for Morningstar, daughter of Running Bear. What occurred during that ceremony changes everything we thought we knew about her path forward." A murmur rippled through the lodge. Vision ceremonies were sacred events, and their results carried enormous weight in Apache decision-making. Several council members leaned forward with interest, while others looked skeptical. "Tell us what you witnessed, Medicine Man," requested Spotted Horse, one of the eldest council members. Singing Crow gestured for Morningstar to stand beside him. "Before I speak of what I witnessed, let Morningstar herself tell you of the vision she received." Morningstar rose with dignity, the eagle feather held reverently in her hands. As she began to speak, her voice carried a quality that had not been there before, a resonance that seemed to fill the entire lodge and command the attention of every person present. She recounted her vision in complete detail, describing the great eagle, the mesa that overlooked all Apache lands, and the specific calling she had received. As she spoke, several of the council members exchanged surprised glances, and she could see recognition in their faces, recognition of descriptions that matched places and symbols from their most sacred traditions. When she finished describing the tasks the eagle had shown her, the schools, the negotiations, the preservation of Apache knowledge and culture, the lodge fell into profound silence. Finally, Singing Crow spoke again. "What Morningstar has described to you is not an ordinary vision. I have conducted many ceremonies in my lifetime, and I have never witnessed spiritual manifestations as powerful as those that occurred 3 nights ago. The spirits themselves confirmed the authenticity of her calling through signs that Gray Wolf Woman and I both witnessed." Gray Wolf Woman rose to stand beside them, her voice strong despite her advanced age. "The sacred fire burned with colors I have never seen before. The eagle feather that appeared in the flames during her vision now rests in her hands, a gift from the spirits themselves. Most importantly, The eagle she describes matches exactly the descriptions passed down in our most ancient stories, the ones my grandmother told me about the great messenger who would come when our people faced their greatest trials. Chief Running Bear struggled visibly with what he was hearing. As Morningstar's father, he wanted to believe that the spirits had provided a way out of this terrible situation. As a tribal leader, he had to consider the political implications of breaking the agreement with Wolf Shadow. These are remarkable claims, he said carefully, but we must also consider the earthly consequences of our decisions. Wolf Shadow expects this marriage to take place as agreed. If we break this arrangement, it could mean war between our peoples. One of Wolf Shadow's representatives, a warrior named Black Knife, stood to address the council. Chief Running Bear speaks wisely. My chief has already made extensive preparations for this marriage ceremony. He has gathered gifts worth many horses, and he has made commitments to other tribes based on this alliance. If Morningstar fails to honor this agreement, it will be seen as a grave insult that demands satisfaction. Morningstar felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Honored council members, I understand the concerns about earthly consequences, but I ask you to consider what the spirits have shown me about the greater challenges our people face. She gestured toward Thomas and Carlos, who had been given permission to observe the proceedings from near the entrance of the lodge. The white man's world is pressing closer to us every day. Already, we have heard reports of Apache bands being forced onto reservations far from their traditional lands. The old ways of making alliances through marriage and warfare may not be enough to protect us in the world that is coming. What are you suggesting? Asked Spotted Horse. I am suggesting that the spirits have shown me a different kind of strength, the strength that comes from understanding and adaptation. The tasks I have been called to perform would help our people in ways that no military alliance could match. Morningstar moved to the center of the circle, addressing each council member in turn. Think about the children in our families who will grow up in a world very different from the one we have known. They will need to understand both our traditional ways and the ways of the outside world if they are to survive and prosper. The schools I am called to establish would provide that education. She turned to face another section of the circle. Think about the treaties and agreements we are forced to negotiate with territorial and federal authorities. How many times have we agreed to things we did not fully understand because we lacked advocates who could navigate their legal systems? The work I am called to do would provide that advocacy. Finally, she addressed her father directly. And think about our history, our stories, our sacred knowledge. Every year, more of our elders pass on, taking irreplaceable wisdom with them. The documentation and preservation work I am called to perform would ensure that future generations of Apache children know who they are and where they come from. The power of her words was evident in the faces around the circle. Several council members were nodding, and even some of the skeptics looked thoughtful. But Black Knife was not impressed. Fine words, he said dismissively, but words do not stop bullets. Words do not provide warriors when enemies attack. The alliance between our peoples would strengthen both tribes in ways that no amount of talking to white authorities could match. Thomas had been given permission to speak if called upon, and now Singing Crow gestured for him to address the council. Honored elders, I have spent considerable time researching how similar situations have been handled in other territories. May I share what I have learned? Chief Running Bear nodded, though he looked uncomfortable about allowing a white man to participate in their sacred proceedings. Thomas stepped forward respectfully, holding the documents he had prepared. What Morningstar has described to you is not just a spiritual calling. It is also a practical solution to very real challenges that Apache people face throughout the Southwest. I have here examples of how communities that have had skilled advocates and cultural liaisons have been able to negotiate much better terms with U.S. authorities. He began reading from his research, citing specific cases where Native American communities had used education and legal advocacy to protect their rights and resources far more effectively than military resistance could have accomplished. The examples were compelling, and several council members asked detailed questions about how such approaches might work for their own people. Furthermore, Thomas continued, I have preliminary agreement from territorial authorities to recognize and support Morningstar's work as a cultural liaison. This would provide her with official status that could protect not just her own activities, but could also create a framework for protecting Apache rights and interests on a broader scale. Carlo stepped forward as well, adding his own perspective. My Apache grandmother always told me that the spirits speak loudest when the need is greatest. Is it not significant that this vision came to Morningstar at exactly the moment when our people face their greatest challenges? Perhaps the spirits are offering us new tools because the old tools are no longer sufficient for the battles ahead. The discussion continued for hours, with council members asking questions, raising concerns, and debating the implications of what they had heard. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that opinion was shifting in favor of recognizing Morningstar's spiritual calling. The breakthrough came when young Wolf, one of the younger council members, made an observation that changed the entire dynamic of the debate. We keep talking about this as if we must choose between spiritual obligations and political necessities. But what if the spirits are offering us something better than what we thought we could achieve through this marriage alliance? He stood and began pacing as he spoke, his excitement evident. Wolf Shadow's alliance would give us perhaps 200 additional warriors for defense. But Morningstar's work could potentially prevent the conflicts that would require such defense. If she can help us negotiate fair treaties, establish legal protections, and build understanding between our peoples and the outside world, that would be far more valuable than any military alliance. Old Woman Dancing, the most senior female member of the council, added her support. I have watched Morningstar grow from a child into a woman of remarkable gifts. She speaks multiple languages, she understands both our ways and outside ways, and she has already proven her ability to build bridges between different peoples. The work she describes is exactly what we need, and she is uniquely qualified to perform it. But the decisive moment came when Singing Crow spoke again. There is something else the council must consider. Last night, after the vision ceremony, I performed divination concerning Evening Rose's illness. What I discovered troubles me greatly. The lodge fell silent. Evening Rose's condition had been the original justification for the marriage arrangement, and any new information about her illness could change everything. The spirits revealed to me that Evening Rose's sickness is not caused by angry spirits requiring appeasement through marriage. Her illness has an earthly cause, poison administered slowly over many months. Gasps of shock and anger filled the lodge. If this was true, it meant the entire foundation for the marriage arrangement was based on deception. Chief Running Bear's face darkened with fury. Are you saying that someone has been deliberately poisoning my daughter to force this marriage? The signs all point to Wolf Shadow's involvement, Singing Crow replied gravely. He has used such methods before to pressure families into arrangements that benefit him. The marriage to Morningstar would not heal Evening Rose. It would simply give Wolf Shadow what he wants while Evening Rose continues to suffer. Black Knife leaped to his feet in outrage. These are serious accusations. You cannot make such claims without proof. The proof is in the medicine itself, Grey Wolf Woman interjected. I examined Evening Rose 3 days ago using the old methods of detection. The signs of slow poisoning are unmistakable to one who knows what to look for. The council erupted in angry voices as the implications of this revelation sank in. If Wolf Shadow had indeed been poisoning Evening Rose to force the marriage arrangement, it represented a violation of sacred law so severe that any agreements with him would be rendered null and void. Chief Running Bear called for order, but the damage to Wolf Shadow's cause was complete. When a formal vote was finally taken, it was unanimous. Morningstar's spiritual calling would be recognized and honored, the marriage arrangement with Wolf Shadow would be declared void due to his deception, and immediate steps would be taken to treat Evening Rose's poisoning and seek justice for the crime committed against her. As the sun set over the Apache settlement that evening, Morningstar stood outside the council lodge, still holding the sacred eagle feather and processing the enormity of what had occurred. Her life had been transformed not just by the spiritual vision she had received, but by the courage of everyone who had supported her right to follow that calling. Thomas approached her as the other participants dispersed to their homes. How are you feeling about everything that's happened? Morningstar looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. I feel like I've been given a great gift and a great responsibility. The work ahead will not be easy, but I know now that it's what I was meant to do. And are you ready for the challenges that will come with Wolf Shadow's reaction to today's decision? Morningstar's jaw set with determination. Wolf Shadow may be angry, but he has been exposed for what he truly is. The council's decision was based not just on my spiritual vision, but on the revelation of his crimes against my family. He will find it difficult to claim any moral authority for revenge when his own actions have been shown to be so dishonorable. As if summoned by their conversation about him, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the settlement at full gallop. As the figure drew closer, they could see it was one of Wolf Shadow's scouts, arriving with news that would test their resolve in ways they had not yet imagined. The scout who thundered into the settlement brought news that sent shockwaves through everyone who heard it. Wolf Shadow was already en route to claim his bride, accompanied by a war party of over 100 warriors. He had left his own territory 2 days earlier than expected, intending to arrive in time for the marriage ceremony, and to demonstrate his power to anyone who might question the arrangement. Chief Running Bear immediately called an emergency war council. The timing could not have been worse. Wolf Shadow and his forces would arrive within 2 days, expecting to find wedding preparations in full swing. Instead, they would discover that the marriage had been canceled and that their chief had been accused of poisoning Evening Rose. Wolf Shadow is not a man who accepts being crossed, warned Spotted Horse as the war council convened in the chief's lodge. When he learns what has happened here today, he will see it as an insult that demands satisfaction. His honor and his political standing will require him to respond with force. Thomas and Carlos have been invited to participate in this emergency council due to their role in the day's events and their potential value in the confrontation ahead. As they listened to the debate about defensive preparations, Thomas realized that their carefully planned solution to Morningstar's predicament had created an entirely new crisis. How many warriors can we muster for defense? Chief Running Bear asked his war leader, a stern man named Ironhawk. 60, perhaps 70 if we call in the young men who are not yet fully trained. Ironhawk replied grimly. Against Wolf Shadow's 100, and fighting on ground he will choose, our chances would not be good. Morningstar, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, suddenly spoke up. There might be another way to handle this situation. All eyes turned to her. As the woman whose spiritual calling had triggered this crisis, she commanded attention when she spoke. Wolf Shadow's power comes from his reputation for ruthlessness and his ability to intimidate others into submission. But that reputation is built on a foundation of secrecy about his methods. What if we stripped away that secrecy? What do you mean? Asked Chief Running Bear. I mean, what if we made sure that when Wolf Shadow arrives, he faces not just our small band, but representatives from multiple Apache groups, along with territorial authorities, and witnesses who can document exactly what happens? What if we turn this into a public confrontation where his actions will be seen and judged by the broader community? Carlos leaned forward with interest. That's brilliant. Wolf Shadow's strength comes from operating in isolation, where he can control the narrative about his actions. If we force him to act in public, with multiple witnesses present, he'll be constrained by the need to maintain some appearance of legitimacy. Thomas was already thinking through the practical implications. I have contacts in the territorial government who could be here within a day if we send fast riders now. And if we frame this correctly, we could position it not as a local tribal dispute, but as a matter of territorial law enforcement, investigating the poisoning of Evening Rose and preventing a forced marriage that violates both Apache law and territorial statutes. Singing Crow nodded slowly. The medicine man agrees. In the old days, when there were disputes between different bands, the traditional approach was to gather witnesses from all affected groups and settle matters in the open, where the spirits could see and judge what was in each person's heart. Ironhawk looked skeptical. And what happens if Wolf Shadow decides to fight anyway? Having witnesses present won't stop bullets or arrows. No, but it will make him think very carefully before he starts a fight he can't control, Morningstar replied. If Wolf Shadow attacks us in front of territorial authorities and representatives from other Apache groups, he'll be starting a war that will draw in the U.S. military and could destroy both our peoples. He's ruthless, but he's not stupid. Chief Running Bear weighed the options carefully. A direct military confrontation with Wolf Shadow's forces would likely end in disaster for his people. But Morningstar's alternative approach, while risky, offered the possibility of resolving the crisis without bloodshed. Very well, he decided. We will send riders immediately to every Apache band within 2 days' travel, asking them to send representatives to witness what happens here. Thomas, can you arrange for territorial authorities to be present as well? I can have a federal marshal here by tomorrow evening, Thomas promised. And I can also arrange for a representative from the territorial governor's office who has experience with Indian affairs. Carlos added, I'll reach out to my contacts in the Mexican border communities as well. This kind of situation affects everyone in the region, and having their voices present could be valuable. As the plans took shape, they realized they were essentially staging a public tribunal that would determine not just the immediate fate of Morningstar and Wolf Shadow, but could also establish important precedents for how such disputes would be handled in the future. The stakes were enormous, but so was the potential for creating lasting positive change. The next day, and a half passed in frantic preparation. Riders galloped in all directions, carrying messages to Apache bands, territorial authorities, and community leaders throughout the region. The settlement itself was transformed as representatives began arriving. Some curious, some concerned, all aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented. By the time Wolf Shadow's dust cloud appeared on the horizon, the Apache settlement had become host to the largest gathering of diverse representatives the territory had ever seen. Apache leaders from 5 different bands were present, along with Federal Marshal James Davidson, Territorial Indian Affairs Coordinator Robert Chun, a representative from the Mexican consulate, and even a newspaper correspondent who had ridden hard from Tucson after hearing rumors of the unusual gathering. Morningstar spent the final hours before Wolf Shadow's arrival in preparation of a very different kind. Working with Singing Crow and Gray Wolf Woman, she performed purification rituals and prayers that would prepare her spiritually for what was to come. She also reviewed the legal and political arguments she would need to present, making sure she understood every aspect of the case against Wolf Shadow. Thomas and Carlos positioned themselves strategically among the gathered witnesses, ready to provide support and documentation as needed. They had prepared comprehensive evidence of Wolf Shadow's pattern of abuse toward his previous wives, his use of poison and intimidation to manipulate tribal politics, and the legitimacy of Morningstar's spiritual calling under both Apache tradition and territorial law. When Wolf Shadow and his war party finally arrived, the sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had expected. Instead of a small settlement preparing for a wedding ceremony, they found a formal gathering that resembled a court of law. The presence of so many witnesses and official representatives immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. Wolf Shadow himself was exactly what Morningstar had expected from the story she had heard. A tall, imposing man in his mid-40s whose every movement radiated controlled violence. His dark eyes swept across the gathered assembly with obvious displeasure as he realized that his carefully planned marriage ceremony had been transformed into something entirely different. Chief Running Bear rose to greet the arrivals with formal courtesy, but his words carried unmistakable steel. Wolf Shadow, you are welcome in our settlement. However, circumstances have changed since our original agreement was made. We have called this gathering to address those changes in a manner that honors both traditional Apache law and the broader legal frameworks under which we all must live. Wolf Shadow's face darkened as he took in the full scope of what had been arranged. I come here expecting to claim my bride according to our agreement. Instead, I find you have turned this into some kind of trial. This is an insult that demands satisfaction. Federal Marshal Davidson stepped forward, his badge clearly visible on his vest. Mr. Wolf Shadow, you are correct that this has become a legal proceeding. We have received serious allegations about criminal activities that may have influenced the marriage arrangement you're referring to. Before any wedding can proceed, these allegations must be investigated and resolved. What allegations? Wolf Shadow demanded, though his eyes showed that he already suspected what was coming. Singing Crow rose slowly, carrying himself with the dignity that came from decades of spiritual leadership. Wolf Shadow, you stand accused of using poison to make Evening Rose ill, creating the crisis that was used to justify forcing Morningstar into marriage with you. This is a violation of sacred law that nullifies any agreements made under its influence. Wolf Shadow's warriors shifted restlessly behind him, hands moving toward their weapons. But the presence of so many witnesses, including armed territorial representatives, made any thoughts of violence extremely risky. These are lies spread by people who seek to avoid honoring their commitments, Wolf Shadow replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Morningstar stepped forward, holding the sacred eagle feather that had become the symbol of her calling. Her voice carried clearly across the gathering as she addressed not just Wolf Shadow, but all the assembled witnesses. Wolf Shadow, you claim that lies are being told to avoid honoring commitments. But the only commitment that matters here is the commitment to truth and justice. 3 nights ago, I received a vision from the Great Spirit that called me to serve my people in ways that would be impossible if I were bound in marriage to you. This calling has been witnessed and verified by our most respected spiritual leaders. She gestured toward Singing Crow and Gray Wolf Woman, who stood ready to testify to what they had witnessed during the ceremony. But even if there had been no spiritual vision, Morning Star continued, the revelation of your role in poisoning my sister would be sufficient grounds to void any marriage arrangement. You have violated the most sacred laws of our people by harming an innocent person to achieve your own purposes. Wolf Shadow's composure began to crack as he realized how thoroughly his position had been undermined. You cannot prove these accusations, he said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Gray Wolf Woman stepped forward, carrying a small bundle of herbs and medicines. I can prove them, she said firmly. I have examined Evening Rose using the traditional methods of detection for poisons. The signs are unmistakable. More than that, I have identified the specific plants used and traced their source to areas near your territory. Marshal Davidson moved closer to Wolf Shadow. Sir, these are serious criminal allegations. If evidence supports claims of attempted murder through poisoning, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest pending a full investigation. The tension in the gathering reached a breaking point as Wolf Shadow's warriors began to spread out in battle formation. For a moment, it seemed that violence was inevitable despite all their careful planning. But then something unexpected happened. 3 of Wolf Shadow's own warriors, men who had served him for years, stepped away from their chief and moved toward the center of the gathering. The oldest of these 3, a grizzled veteran named Stone Bear, spoke in a voice that carried across the assembled crowd. I have served Wolf Shadow for 10 years, and I have seen him use poison before to achieve his goals. I have remained silent because I feared his retaliation, but I will not stand by and watch him destroy more innocent lives. Stone Bear's testimony opened a floodgate. One by one, other members of Wolf Shadow's own war party began to step forward with their own accounts of his crimes and abuses. The public nature of the gathering had given them the protection they needed to finally speak truth about what they had witnessed. As the evidence mounted against him, Wolf Shadow found himself increasingly isolated. His own followers were abandoning him, the assembled witnesses were documenting his crimes, and territorial authorities were preparing to arrest him. The marriage he had demanded was clearly impossible, and his entire power structure was collapsing around him. But Wolf Shadow was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. As the testimonies continued and his position became untenable, his hand moved to the knife at his belt. His eyes fixed on Morningstar with murderous intent. If he could not have her as his bride, perhaps he could prevent her from serving as a witness against him. The confrontation that had been building all day was about to explode into violence, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The moment Wolf Shadow's hand moved to his knife, the entire gathering tensed like a bowstring about to snap. Thomas saw the murderous intent in the man's eyes and started to move forward, but he was too far away to reach Morningstar in time. Carlos was blocked by a group of witnesses, and even the federal marshal was positioned where he couldn't intervene quickly enough. But Morningstar had been watching Wolf Shadow carefully throughout the proceedings, and she had seen the desperation building in his expression. As his hand closed around the handle of his knife, she was already moving, stepping not backward to safety, but forward to meet the threat head-on. What happened next would be remembered and retold in Apache oral tradition for generations to come. As Wolf Shadow lunged toward Morningstar with his blade drawn, she caught his wrist with both hands and used his own momentum against him, employing a defensive technique her father had taught her years earlier. The move sent Wolf Shadow sprawling to the ground, his knife flying harmlessly into the dust. Before he could recover, Stone Bear and 2 other former followers pinned him down, their own disgust with his behavior finally overwhelming their fear of retaliation. Federal Marshal Davidson immediately moved in with iron shackles, placing Wolf Shadow under arrest for attempted assault and the poisoning charges that had been detailed during the testimonies. Wolf Shadow, Marshal Davidson announced formally, "You are under arrest for attempted murder, assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You will be transported to the territorial capital for trial before a federal judge." The gathering erupted in a mixture of cheers, prayers of thanksgiving, and animated discussions about what they had just witnessed. But Morningstar remained calm at the center of the celebration, still holding the sacred eagle feather and maintaining the dignified bearing that had characterized her throughout the entire ordeal. Chief Running Bear approached his daughter with tears in his eyes. "My daughter, you have shown courage that would make our ancestors proud. But more than that, you have shown wisdom in how you handled this crisis. The path forward that you have chosen will benefit not just yourself, but all our people." Singing Crow and Gray Wolf Woman flanked Morningstar, both beaming with pride at how she had fulfilled the calling they had helped her discover. "The spirits chose well when they selected you for this sacred work," Singing Crow observed. "Today's events have demonstrated that you possess not only the vision to see what needs to be done, but the courage and skill to accomplish it." As the immediate crisis subsided and Wolf Shadow was led away under guard, the gathered representatives began discussing the broader implications of what had occurred. The successful resolution of this confrontation had demonstrated something unprecedented, that conflict between different Native American groups could be resolved through legal and diplomatic means rather than violence, and that such resolutions could actually strengthen all the communities involved. Robert Chun, the Territorial Indian Affairs Coordinator, approached Morningstar with obvious admiration. "Miss Morningstar, I've been working in Indian affairs for over 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished here today. The way you transformed a potential war into a legal proceeding, the way you gathered evidence and witnesses, the way you stood up to intimidation. It's exactly the kind of leadership that could make a real difference in improving relations between Native American communities and territorial authorities." "Thank you," Morningstar replied. "But this was not just my accomplishment. It required the courage of many people who were willing to speak truth, the wisdom of our spiritual leaders who helped me understand my calling, and the support of friends like Thomas and Carlos who helped make all of this possible." Thomas stepped forward, his face showing the relief and pride he felt at the successful conclusion of their plan. "Morningstar, what you've achieved here goes far beyond solving your own immediate problem. You've created a model for how conflicts like this can be resolved in the future. More than that, you've demonstrated the kind of leadership that could help all the Apache people navigate the challenges ahead." Carlos nodded in agreement. "My grandmother would have been proud to see how the old wisdom and the new realities came together in what happened here today. You've shown that it's possible to honor tradition while adapting to a changing world." But perhaps the most significant moment came when representatives from the other Apache bands approached Morningstar to discuss the possibility of expanding her work beyond her own community. Young Wolf, who had traveled from a settlement 3 days' ride to the north, spoke for several of the visiting leaders. "Morningstar, what we have witnessed here today convinces us that your calling extends beyond any single band or community. Would you be willing to serve as a liaison and advocate for all Apache people in this region? We face similar challenges in our own territories, and we could benefit greatly from the kind of wisdom and skill you have demonstrated." This was the moment when Morningstar truly understood the full scope of the vision she had received during the sacred ceremony. The eagle had shown her work that would benefit all Apache people, and now she was being invited to step into that role on a scale larger than she had initially imagined. "I would be honored to serve in that capacity," she replied after a moment of silent prayer. "But such work would require resources and support that no single community could provide alone." Thomas had been anticipating this development and was ready with a proposal he had been refining throughout the day's events. "I've been discussing this possibility with Marshal Davidson and Coordinator Chun. The territorial government is willing to establish an official position for a Native American cultural liaison and advocate with a salary and resources that would allow you to travel throughout the region and work with multiple communities." The federal marshal confirmed this offer. The events of the past 2 days have convinced territorial authorities that having someone in such a position could prevent many of the conflicts and misunderstandings that currently plague relations between Native American communities and government agencies. Miss Morningstar has demonstrated exactly the qualifications needed for such a role. Coordinator Chun added, "We're also prepared to support the establishment of the educational programs you described in your vision. There's growing recognition that helping Native American children develop skills for the modern world while maintaining connection to their cultural heritage is crucial for long-term peace and prosperity in the territory. As the sun began to set over the settlement, bringing an end to one of the most extraordinary days in its history, Morning Star stood surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her courage and vision. But her thoughts turned to the person whose health and welfare had been the original catalyst for all these events. "I need to see my sister," she told her father. "With Wolf Shadow's arrest and the exposure of his poisoning scheme, we can begin proper treatment for Evening Rose's illness." Grey Wolf Woman accompanied Morning Star to the lodge where Evening Rose had been resting. The young woman, though still weak from months of gradual poisoning, was already showing signs of improvement now that the source of her illness had been identified and eliminated. "Sister," Evening Rose whispered as Morning Star knelt beside her bed, "I heard the sound of the gathering today. Did everything work out as you hoped?" Morning Star gently took her sister's hand. "Better than I dared to hope. Wolf Shadow has been arrested, the marriage arrangement has been canceled, and I've been given the opportunity to pursue the work I believe the spirits are calling me to do. But most importantly, we now know what was making you sick, and Grey Wolf Woman says you should recover completely within a few weeks." Evening Rose's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "I was so afraid that you would be forced to sacrifice your happiness to save my life. Instead, it seems like the spirits have provided a way to save us both." Outside the lodge, as the various representatives prepared to depart the next morning, Thomas and Carlos found themselves reflecting on the remarkable chain of events that had begun with a desperate plea for help and had culminated in something far greater than any of them had initially imagined. 3 weeks ago, "We were just trying to help Morning Star avoid an unwanted marriage," Carlos observed. "Now she's positioned to become one of the most influential Native American leaders in the territory." Thomas nodded, watching Morning Star as she spoke with representatives from different Apache bands about coordinating their efforts to address common challenges. She was always destined for something like this. The forced marriage crisis just provided the catalyst that helped her discover her true calling. Over the following months, Morning Star's work exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The educational programs she established became models that were replicated throughout the Southwest. Her advocacy work resulted in fair treaties and agreements that protected Apache rights and resources while facilitating peaceful coexistence with non-Apache communities. Most importantly, her success demonstrated that Native American women could play leadership roles in the changing world of the late 19th century. The story of how a forced marriage was prevented through a clever plan involving spiritual visions, legal maneuvering, and community action became legendary throughout the region. But those who knew Morning Star understood that the real significance of what had happened lay not in the cleverness of the plan itself, but in the courage and wisdom she had shown in fulfilling a calling that served all her people. Wolf Shadow was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. Several of his former followers, including Stone Bear, chose to remain in Chief Running Bear's territory and contribute to the positive changes that Morning Star's work was bringing about. Thomas and Morning Star's relationship evolved into a deep partnership focused on the work they were both committed to. He is a rancher who facilitated understanding between different communities, and she is an advocate and cultural bridge builder. Their love story became part of the larger story of how the American Southwest was transformed through cooperation rather than conflict. Years later, when Morning Star had become one of the most respected voices in territorial politics, and her educational programs had helped hundreds of Apache children prepare for successful lives in the modern world, people would ask her about the secret to her success. Her answer was always the same. The spirits provide the vision, but human beings must provide the courage to act on what they see. The clever plan that saved me from a forced marriage was really just people working together to create possibilities that seemed impossible when we started. Evening Rose recovered completely from her poisoning and went on to become a skilled medicine woman herself, specializing in the detection and treatment of cases where traditional illnesses had non-traditional causes. She often said that her sister's courage in facing down Wolf Shadow had inspired her own dedication to protecting others from similar threats. The sacred eagle feather that had appeared during Morning Star's vision ceremony was preserved and eventually became one of the most important spiritual artifacts in Apache tradition, a symbol of how ancient wisdom could guide people through modern challenges. It was displayed in the first cultural center that Morningstar established, where it served as a reminder to future generations that the spirits continue to provide guidance to those who have the courage to seek it. The story of the rancher's clever plan to save a giant Apache sister from a forced wedding became more than just a tale of individual triumph. It became a foundational legend for a new way of resolving conflicts, building communities, and creating futures that honored the best of both traditional wisdom and modern possibilities. In the end, the greatest cleverness of the plan was not in its complexity, but in its recognition that the most powerful solutions come from understanding what people truly need and having the courage to help them achieve it.